There comes a moment in every field of science when a single question tears open the seams of an entire narrative. In human evolution, that question is astonishingly simple, yet no paleoanthropologist will ever ask this question publicly. Why were the Yoruba of West Africa chosen to represent the African population rather than the oldest human lineage on Earth? Why aren't the Mbuti or San, who split off over 300,000 years ago, used for the out-of-Africa baseline? We know that our species is over 300,000 years old, so why use a population that is only 70,000 years old to represent the root of humanity? It is a question that Out of Africa tried to bury. But some truths do not remain buried. It is a question that glows like a fuse. For over a decade it lay untouched, not because it was unclear, but because its consequences were too enormous. If the root was wrong, then everything built upon it. The divergence dates, the bottleneck models, the migration timelines, the story of a single African origin was resting on a broken pillar.
These individuals lived about 300,000 years ago. And that is mind-boggling because we thought our species was only about 200,000 years old. What these fossils tell us is that our species, Homo sapiens, is 100,000 years older than we thought. We are a third older than we realized.
The fact is that the Yoruba were chosen because they are around the same age as the mythical out-of-Africa migration. They were chosen simply to support a predetermined model. But as archaeologists and genetics keep finding older and older fossils and genetics in Eurasia, they keep moving the out-of-Africa event further back in time. In the 1980s, it was 30,000 years ago. Today it is 70,000 years ago, with some models approaching 100,000 years. So they chose the Yoruba and tried to bury the Mbuti. Look at any genetic tree and you see the Mbuti placed off on a side branch as if they have nothing to do with the root of modern humans, as if they are just an archaic branch that nobody wants to talk about. Some trees will have Yoruba as the anchor for the out-of-Africa branch. Why? Because the mythical population that gave rise to all non-Africans is a ghost population. They don't exist. So Out of Africa had to make up a population to stand in their place in genetic models. The Out of Africa model tried to bury this contradiction. Its proponents declared that the debate was over. They proclaimed that they had driven the final nail into the coffin and that the coffin was buried in the ground. They believed they had sealed the story permanently, but the coffin contained a living truth. The truth waited for the correct genetic root to appear. While the Yoruba became the anchor, the most ancient lineages in Africa remained unknown. Deeply divergent populations such as the Mbuti of Central Africa, whose separation from all other humans reaches back 300,000 to 350,000 years, were invisible to the earliest models. Without them, the entire picture of human origins collapsed inward, forcing an unnaturally shallow timeline upon the species. Eurasian populations, which had survived volcanic winters, glacial collapses and drowned continents, appeared artificially young. African populations, protected within equatorial refugia, appeared artificially ancient. The illusion was complete. When the Mbuti genomes finally entered the scientific world, the illusion should have shattered. The human story should have instantly expanded into a panorama. The oldest split in modern humanity was not 70,000 years old, but hundreds of thousands of years older. The early modern fossils of Eurasia, once treated as inconvenient or impossible, suddenly should have aligned with genetic reality. But this never happened, at least not publicly. The deepest African lineage must be used as the reference point for human population structure. For years, genetic models used the Yoruba of West Africa as the default anchor, not because they were the oldest, not because they were unadmixed, not because they reflected ancient African diversity, but because they were convenient and geographically located in sub-Saharan Africa, and the entire human evolutionary timeline was built upon it. The new model corrects this by replacing Yoruba with the Mbuti, a Central African forager population whose genetic divergence from all other humans reaches back 350,000 years. The Mbuti split is not a minor correction, It tears open the compressed timelines of traditional models and reveals a far older, far more structured, far more complex human past. Once this baseline is restored, the entire tree reroots itself, and a new picture emerges. One where modern humans are the result of a pan-continental Afro-Eurasian population system that existed long before any supposed recent African expansion. Africa contains fragments of this structure, but so do the Levant, Arabia, Europe, and Asia. This does not place the origin in any single landmass. It shows that by 300,000 years ago, the ancestors of modern humans were already living across a wide geographic region. Africa, in this view, is not a singular cradle, but part of a distributed evolutionary landscape. Eurasia is not a late recipient, but a region with deep continuity, repeatedly pruned by climatic catastrophe. The true bottleneck in human evolution is not a migration event, but the Toba super-eruption 75,000 years ago, which drastically reduced Eurasian populations and reshaped the surviving gene pool. This reveals a human evolutionary story far richer and more coherent than any model built upon a young West African baseline. Eurasian haplogroups appear genetically young because they suffered repeated extinctions from the Toba super-eruption and from the expansion of ice sheets. Entire Eurasian lineages vanished in single catastrophic events. Their genetic signatures were erased again and again. Africa, protected from Toba's ashfall and from glacial devastation, preserved ancient lineages such as A00, A0 and A1. These lineages survived because their environments protected them. This is also when the Yoruba migrate into Western Africa, splitting off from their Eurasian North African cousins. In this sense, Africa was a refugia that protected ancient lineages. Haplogroup A is not the ancestor of non-African lineages. It shares an ancestor. It is not the root. This is another major problem with Out of Africa that they jump through hoops trying to explain away. While they use the Yoruba as the root of non-Africans for the Out of Africa bottlenecks, they use haplogroup A as the root for the male Y-DNA lineage. This makes no sense. Just look at the charts. Once you realize that the split between Africa and Eurasia is 300,000 years old and not 70,000 years old, then this all makes sense. The dominance of the Yoruba root in population genetics emerged not from evolutionary logic, but from logistical convenience. The earliest genomic projects needed large, organized, cooperative populations. The Yoruba matched these criteria better than the Mbuti. Their genomes entered the databases, anchored the computational models, and became the representative African lineage for nearly every analysis. But the Yoruba are not ancient in evolutionary terms. They descend from relatively recent demographic expansions associated with the Holocene spread of Niger-Congo languages, agriculture, and changing ecological conditions in West Africa. Their divergence from Eurasians is not deep. It rests in the 60 to 80,000 year range, far too young to represent the beginning of humanity. Their allele frequencies reflect exposure to Holocene diseases, changes in subsistence strategies, and selective pressures that have nothing to do with deep time. The Mbuti, by contrast, represent a lineage whose divergence reaches back 300,000 to 350,000 years. This separation predates the earliest fossils associated with clearly modern human morphology. It predates the Homo remains of East Africa, the early Levantine moderns at School and Kafza, the transitional assemblages at Jebel Irhoud and Florisbad, and all Eurasian fossils traditionally dismissed as too early. The Mbuti divergence is the true root. It is older, deeper, and structurally necessary to reconstruct the ancient population landscape of the Pleistocene. When geneticists finally recognized this, the entire evolutionary map shifted. The human tree no longer pointed toward a narrow African origin followed by a late dispersal. It pointed toward a broad, ancient, interconnected network stretching across Africa and Eurasia during the Middle Pleistocene. The Yoruba root had hidden this world. The Mbuti root revealed it. The human tree, once rooted shallowly in West Africa, demanded to be replanted at the deeper, older, far more stable Mbuti divergence. When the tree was rooted correctly, the branches no longer twisted into impossible shapes. They formed a coherent, elegant structure that matched the fossil record, the archaeology, and the climate history of the Pleistocene. This is the first reconstruction of human evolution built from the correct genetic root. It is a model that does not diminish Africa, but returns the entire world to the evolutionary stage on which it actually stood. It restores the true scale of human antiquity. It acknowledges that the earliest Homo sapiens were not confined to a single cradle, but spread across a vast Afro-Eurasian belt, long before any narrow version of our species was recognized. It reveals a world where human ancestors existed both inside and outside of Africa over 300,000 years ago. Genetics know the truth, but they have come to a compromise with out-of-Africa paleoanthropologists because the out-of-Africa catchphrase is too important to discard. Geneticists know Homo sapiens are at least 300,000 years old, so archaeologists reclassified Jebel Irhoud as early Homo sapiens to fit the new information in case any Homo sapiens fossils are found outside of Africa that are older. However, Out of Africa spent decades pretending North Africa didn't exist. It treated the entire northern rim of the continent, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya and Egypt, as a geographical afterthought, a blank space on the map, a region that somehow had nothing to do with the supposed birthplace of modern humans. The textbooks highlighted East Africa and sometimes South Africa, drawing a neat circle around these regions as if human evolution took place in a sealed laboratory. But anyone with even a passing familiarity with a map can see that North Africa is not a remote corner. It is the very edge of Africa, the hinge between continents, staring directly into the Levant, Arabia and southern Europe. Ignoring North Africa was not just careless, it was an act of narrative desperation. It allowed the classic Out of Africa story to appear clean and self-contained, but only by pretending that one of the most geographically important regions on Earth was irrelevant. This selective blindness should have been a warning sign from the start, because no logically thinking human being could seriously look at North Africa, see its proximity to Eurasia, and conclude that populations on its doorstep were somehow hermetically sealed off for hundreds of thousands of years. Everything changed when the Jebel Irhoud fossils in Morocco were redated to more than 300,000 years ago. Suddenly, early Homo sapiens like humans were not just in East Africa, but all the way across the continent, perched on the northwest tip, facing Europe and the Mediterranean coast. The neat narrative began to unravel, because if humans were already in Morocco 300,000 years ago, then the idea that they sat quietly in Africa, refusing to move into Eurasia until a magical exodus 60,000 years ago, becomes laughable. The geography alone destroys the story.
Africa, our homeland. This is where it all began. We are all Africans.
The Strait of Gibraltar is a short crossing. The Sinai is a land bridge. The Mediterranean periodically created coastal corridors. Climate cycles repeatedly opened green pathways across the Sahara. To insist after Jebel Irhoud that humans stayed locked inside Africa is not just unscientific, it is absurd. A logically thinking person does not need a PhD to see that early Homo sapiens in Morocco were perfectly positioned to move into southern Eurasia whenever the environment allowed. The only reason the old model resisted this conclusion is because it was already trapped in its own myth. The slogans were more precious than the evidence. The defenders of the old narrative refused to update the storyline. Instead, they invented a new rhetorical trick, declaring that these early North African populations did not contribute to modern humans. This move was nothing more than an intellectual escape hatch, a way to acknowledge the fossils without allowing them to challenge the theory. By labeling them failed migrations or dead ends, the Out of Africa model could preserve the fiction that nothing meaningful happened outside East Africa until the sanctioned exodus occurred. Yet such a statement is not based on evidence. It is based on protecting a slogan. No one can prove that Irhoud's populations left no descendants. No one can verify that they did not contribute genes to later groups. These claims are simply narrative weapons used to push inconvenient fossils out of the story. A scientific model that must invent ad hoc categories like failed migration to remain intact is not a model at all. It is a superstition. And Jebel Irhoud was only the beginning. The Apidema fossil from Greece, dated to roughly 210,000 years ago, showed early Homo sapiens traits deep inside Europe, long before the so-called real exodus. This should have ended the conversation. It should have shattered the island Africa illusion immediately. If early Homo sapiens like humans are in Morocco at 300,000 years and in Greece at 210,000 years, then the only rational conclusion is that human populations were flowing between Africa and Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. Yet instead of accepting this obvious conclusion, the out-of-Africa defenders again resorted to the same desperate narrative patch, calling Apidema a failed migration. But labeling a fossil as failed explains nothing. It is not data. It is denial. When a theory requires calling hard fossil evidence irrelevant to survive, the theory has already died. The most surprising voice is that of Rebecca Cann, the scientist whose work on mitochondrial DNA helped create the out-of-East Africa narrative itself. When asked about Jebel Irhoud, Cann dismissed the fossil as an evolutionary nothing burger, arguing that transitional forms are expected everywhere and that Irhoud offered nothing new scientifically. She insisted that evolution does not produce perfect beginnings and endings, and that the obsession with earliest Homo sapiens misrepresents the gradual and mosaic nature of human evolution. Cann's comments were not just a critique of Irhoud, but a critique of the narrative that had co-opted her own work for decades. Yet Dr. Cann's dismissal of the Jebel Irhoud fossils as an evolutionary nothing burger is not simply a cranky remark from a retired geneticist. It is a public admission by the co-creator of mitochondrial Eve that the entire framework of the earliest Homo sapiens is built on flawed logic. Cann's actual view has always been far more sophisticated than the public narrative that grew around her work. She never believed in a single African Eve in the literal sense. She never believed in a sudden origin of modernity. She never believed in a clean break or a perfect beginning. When she says Irhoud is just transitions, she is saying, in polite academic language, that the search for the first modern human is a fool's errand, and that the out-of-East Africa model distorted what her genetic evidence actually meant. Once the Mbuti route is used, the fossil record ceases to be a puzzle. It becomes a continuous story. The Dali skull in China emerges as the Asian counterpart to the Jebel Irhoud fossils of North Africa. Both date to approximately the same period. Both show transitional features approaching modernity. Under the out-of-Africa model, Dali appeared to threaten the chronology. Once you realize that modern humans existed outside of Africa, Dali is one of the strongest confirmations that early Homo sapiens-grade populations existed across continents. The fossils of Skul and Kafze in the Levant take their rightful place as the western link in this ancient chain. They represent fully modern humans living outside Africa at the same time as Homo 1 lived within it. Their presence is not a failed migration, but a confirmation that early modern humans were widespread. Petrolona and Apidema in Greece extend this continuum into southern Europe. The reassignment of Apidema 1 as a 200,000-year-old Homo sapiens fossil forces the recognition that modern humans existed in Europe long before the supposed African exodus. The extra-African origins model simply accepts this as part of the shared pan-continental pattern. Further east, the Lujiang cranium in southern China, the upper cave remains at Zhoukoudian, and the deep cave skulls of Borneo reveal a lineage that persisted for tens of thousands of years. These fossils are not intruders or anomalies. They are the ancestors of the southern Eurasian populations whose continuity was only disrupted by later waves of climatic catastrophe. Oasi in Romania, with his blend of modern and archaic ancestry, is not a migrant from a recent African expansion. He is part of the long Eurasian lineage, shaped by glacial cycles, bottlenecks, and ancient genetic structure. Bacho Kiro, Slati Kun, Oase, and Ranis genomes from Europe dated between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago, are closer to modern East Asians than to ancient Africans. How is this possible if humans all descend from an out-of-Africa bottleneck only 60,000 years ago? Cro-Magnon in Europe, long recognized for robust modernity, is not the origin of anything. Modern morphological studies show that Cro-Magnon, Oase, Upper Cave, Luijiang all form a 300,000-year-old Eurasia lineage that connects to School Kafse in the Levant. Cro-Magnon is the northernmost terminal branch of a lineage that stretches back through Oase, back through Petrolona and Epidima, back through the Levantine early moderns, and back, ultimately, into the tropical and subtropical belt of southern Eurasia. The continuous Eurasian lineage exists. It always existed. The Yoruba root simply hid it. The dominance of the out-of-Africa narrative was not maintained through evidence alone. It was reinforced through the suppression of evidence that contradicted the model. Scholars who noted the similarities between Cro-Magnon, School, Kafse, the Upper Cave remains, and the early modern fossils of southern China were dismissed, marginalized, or labeled as unscientific. Their work was quietly abandoned, ignored in bibliographies, and excluded from university courses. The comparisons between these fossils were metaphorically burned, removed from circulation without formal refutation. These ideas were never Eurocentric. The Cro-Magnon theory did not propose that Europe was the origin of modern humans. It proposed that Cro-Magnon represented a European expression of a Eurasian lineage with deep roots in the Levant, South Asia, and East Asia. It argued that early modern humans in Europe descended from populations that had lived in these regions for tens of thousands of years. This was not Eurocentrism. It was a recognition of continuity. Once the Mbuti split was finally integrated into genomic models, the suppressed comparisons returned to light. Cro-Magnon, School, Kafse, Upper Cave, Luijiang, Oase, Petrolona, and Epidima all aligned into a single Eurasian continuum. The story that Out of Africa tried to bury resurfaced with undeniable force. Modern humans were not born in a single cradle. They arose from a pan-continental system of populations stretching across Africa and Eurasia, long before the narrow timelines of the 20th century allowed. The evidence did not change. We simply became able to see it again. This new model restores the world to the true story of human evolution. It begins with a single realization. A tree rooted in the wrong soil cannot grow correctly. The Yoruba root forced the human tree into unnatural shapes. It produced timelines that contradicted fossils. It produced bottlenecks that contradicted archaeology. It produced a narrow, linear history out of a world that was never narrow and never linear. The Mbuti root restores the correct foundation. Once the tree is planted in deeper soil, the branches align. Africa holds the ancient isolates. Eurasia holds the ancient continuity. The fossils line up across continents. The climate data confirms what the bones already whispered. The genetic evidence finally matches the world in which humans actually lived. Out of Africa tried to bury this story. It declared the coffin closed and the grave filled. But the truth did not die. Even out of Africa, purists have been quietly building an escape plan by admitting that Homo sapiens could have originated in Asia 1 million years ago, and they quietly speak of extra-African origins. But they are afraid to tell the public the truth, so they quietly chip away at the edges of Out of Africa because they know that the day will come when Out of Africa will come crumbling down because the pillars are too weak to hold the theory. The truth waited beneath the soil until the correct root touched it. Once it did, the entire buried narrative blossomed again into the light. The human story did not begin in one place. It began across a world. The extra-African origins model allows us to see that world as it truly was, vast, ancient, interconnected, and alive with humanity, long before our species had a name. Thanks for watching.